Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 8, and today I'm going to be discussing the 5 phases of codependency. Another jolly topic. In all seriousness though, I don't consider it to be a dark topic at all. If you've been listening to my content, hopefully by now you've grasped the main thread, which is to do with taking personal responsibility and seeing things as they are, neither with a victim mentality nor with an aggressive and hateful mentality, but to walk the middle way. And, that is very much, in a nutshell, what we need to be doing on the path of spiritual growth, because it's really about becoming conscious. It's about moving dynamically with the world the way it is, as opposed to merely meeting specification, trying to find one-size-fits-all answers to life's challenges, because none of those will work permanently. So in order to grow spiritually and become conscious, we have to be able to integrate our opposites, which in the case of a codependent dynamic may well be, on one hand, the devil in us, right? The need and the desire to push back and uphold our own needs. But at the same time, the need for compassion, forgiveness, understanding, non-judgmentalism, but avoiding the dangers of either extreme. That's really what life's journey is all about, from one perspective, from a quite a broad perspective. Of course, it's not about that for everybody all the time. It can be about finding a job. It can be about finding a life partner. It can be about raising children. It can be about all these different things. But these are all challenges on the path of becoming conscious. So with that said, the title of today's episode is the 5 phases of codependency. I want to give a recap now as to what that is, what I actually mean by codependency from a psycho-spiritual perspective, because there is the classical understanding of codependency. And as I discussed in earlier episodes, in particular, the episode on cults and what is a cult, and in that previous episode, I described how traditionally we think of codependency as occurring when a relationship breaks down in an argument or breaks apart, or we think of it in terms of these very surface level, perhaps even measurable symptoms. However, I made the case that actually codependency exists on a kind of spectrum, and that actually we need not look for these external obvious features to be able to call it for what it is, and that actually it's way more common in society than many of us would believe right now. And it comes about as a result of our obsession with using the world to placate our own inner conflicts and our spiritual vacuity and our total misunderstanding of what spirituality actually is, and our pursuit of materialism and our materialist view of the world. Because of course, if the world is just stuff to be manipulated to our ends, forget about our inner worlds, right? Forget about taking responsibility for the mind. If we can just make the world a certain way, then maybe we'll feel secure in ourselves, right? Well, maybe for about 5 minutes, but of course, we're not addressing the underlying causes here, which is our minds ultimately. So I define codependency as any situation where 2 or more people are unconsciously using each other to regulate their own unresolved psychological conflict whilst neglecting to take responsibility for it themselves. So first of all, unconsciously using each other, that means that relying on each other to create pleasant feelings and to suppress painful feelings, that is to regulate their own unresolved psychological conflict, but not necessarily realizing that that is what they're doing. So this isn't a judgment. It's not a way of saying people are bad or wrong for doing this. It's just that it's not necessarily easy to realize what's actually going on here, especially given the current paradigm that we live in. Everything in our society is geared towards getting us to think that if we can just make the world a certain way, then we'll be fine. And so it's down to each individual to take responsibility for it themselves And that is why there's so much talk now about personal responsibility and sovereignty, and why people like Jordan Peterson have become so popular, and why he himself is talking a lot about Jung, and like knowledge of Jung is starting to spread, even though Jung died several decades ago. So this is something that I talk about. I talk about the 7 habits of individuation and why it's really important to, as part of habit 1, to take responsibility for your own mind. And that means understanding there is an unconscious mind, and that our cravings and our aversions in this world give us clues as to what it is that remains unresolved in ourselves. And it means understanding that if we address our inner world, the outer world will actually move and shift to reflect what's going on for us. But here's the thing, codependency is synonymous with abuse when described in this way. Whether it's between 2 people or a group of people, essentially it's the same thing, whether we're talking about an exploitative cult or whether we're talking about just a 2-person relationship. If both people are not seeing how their own unresolved conflict is leading to this situation, then there is by default abuse that's involved. Now, it's certainly true that, let's take a simple 2-person dynamic, there may be something akin to an abuser and a victim in that arrangement. But firstly, it's not necessarily clear who's who, right? Because the victim often doesn't believe they're a victim. And often there's a lot of confusion around that. We talked about Darvo, where an abuser will actually try and reverse the roles of victim and offender to cover up their own perpetration of abuse. But here's the thing, wherever someone is falling in love with the idea of something at the expense of the real thing, where they're chasing validation, attention, and admiration in place of genuine love and connection, there will be abuse. Because at some point along the line, whilst those 2 pursuits, that is attention and validation on one hand, true love and connection on the other, by pursuing the former, it may look like the latter for quite some time. But at some point along the line, it will be necessary to choose one over the other. And for someone who is attached to what merely looks like true love and connection, because there's this unresolved feeling that hasn't been made conscious, they will ultimately be forced to choose that option over the real thing. And at that point, it will be like all the cards are laid down on the table, all the guise, all the suggestion of true love and connection will in a mere instant be thrown out the window. So there is always abuse involved in codependency, but there's a reason I didn't call this the 5 stages of abuse. We'll get onto that, because this is about taking responsibility for one's own mind. And that's not merely a pragmatic approach, it's a real approach. It's about understanding that nothing is truly being done to us. In a practical sense, that may be more or less true. Like, there are abusers, there is evil in the world. Carl Jung talked about it. Like, it is not merely about saying, oh, well, everything's a projection. Because on some level it is. But on another level, we need to be able to really understand what's going on holistically here. And that means understanding how we have attracted the situation on one hand, but on the other hand, being able to call a spade, and understanding that there is evil, there is abuse, and it comes from, or it arises from, rather, the fact that certain things aren't made conscious. We can't make other people conscious, only they can do that, but we can develop our own consciousness. And that's what we're here for. So the aims of this session are to, 1, find your bearings in the cycle of abuse, whether you're in a situation right now or whether you're gaining insight into a previous situation. Understanding where we are in that map can really be instrumental in moving us towards recovery from that abuse. Second aim is to understand the challenges, the risks, and the opportunities at each of these 5 phases of codependency. Third aim is to use that to inform your decisions around your next course of action. And a sort of bonus aim here would be to understand how best to help loved ones who may be in a codependent dynamic or have left a codependent dynamic, depending on what phase they are in. Helps us be a lot more precise in how we help others. if you have been learning about abuse and codependency and narcissism, you've most likely come across the traditional 5 stages of abuse. And these are normally laid out as idealization, devaluation, and discarding. Now, whilst that may sound familiar to you, I believe it's a problematic model because, first of all, it only explains what the narcissist is doing, not what is happening in your own mind. And therefore, I find it's quite a disempowering model because it's implying that one is a victim that is being acted upon. And actually, that doesn't ever solve the problem because, we could put the narcissist in jail, right? We could tell everyone what they've been doing. We could spread the truth about that. And we could really point out the reality of their unconsciousness and their evil behavior. But that is only part of the story and actually fails to practice habit 1. It fails to take responsibility for what's going on in ourselves. Another reason this is a problematic model is because, quite simply, it doesn't always play out that way, especially if you claim your sovereignty as suggested. It doesn't always happen in the way of, first there's the idealization, then there's the devaluation, then there's this discarding. Like sometimes there's the idealization, and then you start to realize something's not quite right here, and then you take the power back and make a informed and conscious choice to move on before perhaps even the devaluation, let alone the discarding. So I find the 3-stage of abuse model, therefore, of very limited value in recovery. It may be a somewhat accurate description of what abusers do, but I don't find it a very useful map for making the unconscious conscious in yourself and understanding what is actually happening in your own mind and how your own mind is playing a role in creating the situation. So the 5 phases of codependency then are 1, the attraction phase, 2, the bliss phase, 3, the conflict phase, 4, the clash phase, and 5, the recovery phase. So fairly self-explanatory on the surface, but I'm going to now delve in a bit more detail into each one and really understand what is going on inside our own mind, what are the risks, challenges, and opportunities at each phase, and therefore what you can do at each phase. By the way, I go into this detail in my ebook as well. That's called the Cult Recovery Guide. It goes into detail in each of these 5 phases, and it applies equally to cult situations. That's group codependent dynamics, whether it's a religious group or a workplace or a self-help cult. And it equally applies to 2-person relationships as well, if there is a codependent dynamic. So whichever of those sounds more interesting to you, you can head over to makeitconscious.com/free guide and download that guide. And I think you'll find that interesting and useful. So what I will say is that every phase of involvement with a narcissist or a cult can be very intense as falling in love, or even more so, right? In some of these cults, we're talking about the projection of our deepest numinous unconscious content. Projecting our anima or animus onto a person is one thing, but projecting our inner hero or Christ or self onto another person and unconsciously behaving as though this person is faultless, perfect in every way, that they're perhaps enlightened or they've reached the culmination of human potential, only to inexorably be let down and realize that they're not, and that's impossible, and that they are merely human. That can be very, very difficult. And this is all happening at an unconscious level. If one believes that they're not the kind of person to, say, join a cult, see that episode on what is a cult, then if anything, you are more susceptible to that happening, because the unconscious is being projected all the time. Projection is something that happens to us. It's not something we do. And by and large, it is those who don't acknowledge the existence of an unconscious, who don't believe that they're being strung along, that believe that only a certain kind of person would be involved in an exploitative group in this way. Those are the people who are not only most susceptible to such dynamics, but are actually most likely in such dynamics and not realize. When you go down the abuse rabbit hole, you may start to see the whole of society very differently. And, what you thought was a niche activity that only certain kinds of people got involved in, it's actually kind of a complete 180 flip from that. And you start to realize actually the minority are those that are sovereign and that are no longer involved in a kind of abusive group codependent dynamic. Because remember, we're not merely talking about strange looking acolytes in white robes performing some kind of bizarre ritual. We're talking about workplaces, we're talking about governments, we're talking about families, we're talking about friendship groups, we're talking about any situation where people are unconsciously using each other to regulate their own unresolved feelings. And that is the modal approach to relationships in the modern age. It's reflected in all of our media. It's encouraged in all of our institutions. It is the primary way in which people approach their lives because it is just a lot easier in the short term. It's a way of grasping at relief from our perpetual discomfort, whatever it is, whether it's fear of abandonment, whether it's hunger, whether it's any kind of physiological pain, all with roots in our childhood, of course, the first 6-7 years of life when we were particularly unconscious and rapidly coming to consciousness. All those emotional imprints on our psyche, which remain in the unconscious, are driving our actions moment to moment, day to day. And the vast majority are walking around totally unaware of this, not realizing how their own unconscious mind is pointing them into these various situations of pain and struggle and just continually looking for that expedient solution. So every phase can be very intense as falling in love, because it is about the projection of deep, numinous, unconscious content, which we would rather engage with through these external objects and people rather than make conscious in ourselves, because it just always involves a great release of pain and catharsis and energy to face up to. And that's challenging, and the ego would rather not go there. So the intensity is certainly the case during the initial attraction and the bliss phases, but continues, albeit in a painful way, in the subsequent conflict and clash phases, when the intensity of leaving can then serve as the motivation for making a thorough recovery. And so often, whatever kind of challenges we come up against in life, whether it is a challenging relationship, which is not, as I said, even really unique, it's actually something that everybody has to go through, I would even say. Like, no one is born capable of having perfect relationships. So, we have to go through these experiences, and we'll most likely have to go through several iterations. And if there's something that's not being made conscious, it will keep reoccurring, perhaps getting more intense, but perhaps just the fact that it's reoccurring several times will make us go, hang on a second, there's something maybe here I'm not seeing. And at that point, the intensity of leaving a situation can therefore serve as the motivation for navigating the recovery phase in a skillful way. So I'm going to talk now about the attraction phase. And this is a line from the cult recovery guide that I wrote. And I said that deception is a guaranteed feature of the cult recruitment process. No one would join a cult if they knew they were signing themselves up for exploitation in support of its leader's fantastical vision. So if ever we're walking into a situation of abuse, clearly we wouldn't do that if we knew that's what was about to happen. So as much as this is about taking personal responsibility, it's certainly not about denial of evil, deception, malevolence. If anything, it's about coming to terms with it, understanding that it is a feature of human nature. And again, not merely from the stance of, I guess that's how it is. That's kind of like a slightly facile and blasé kind of way of understanding evil. It's about integrating that understanding, not merely saying, that's how it is. It's about coming to terms with it, understanding the necessity of it, understanding that it actually compels growth. And if there wasn't an unconscious, there'd be no life, there'd be no existence. There'd be nothing to build, there'd be nothing to build from. There'd be no story, no journey. So evil exists for teleological reasons. It's actually a necessary component of reality. That doesn't mean we excuse it. It doesn't even mean we can't minimize it. I believe we can. I don't think it's necessary in the quantity in which it exists today, but it comes about nonetheless as a result of unconsciousness, of people not knowing why they're doing what they're doing and mistaking mere appearances and symbols of what they need for the real thing, falling in love with a symbol and cheating on the realness which they represent. So there is always deception involved at the attraction phase, and it tends to have a heady and magnetic quality. So when you first encounter an abuser or a narcissist, you might feel euphorically happy, or you might feel merely peaceful and content. In any case, you can't explain it fully, but things just seem right, like they are meant to be, that this is what you have been searching for. And of course, it feels like that because you're engaging with an aspect of yourself that hasn't been made conscious. So in a sense, you are coming to know your own mind through this interaction. It might be at a basic level, let's say you're a heterosexual man. It might be that you are engaging with your anima, like the inner feminine, the idealized feminine aspect of yourself. And it might be that through one's own naivete, you have entirely projected this ideal image onto a beautiful woman. However, it may also be that that woman is deliberately trying to remove you from your center. So actually, it takes two to tango in this sense, right? It's not merely that you have projected, but actually they have been deliberately acting as the hook for your projection. So it's one thing just falling head over heels in love with a girl in your teenage years and just doing that completely of your own naivete and just imagining all this idealized stuff about this person. And that could be anybody, right? It could merely be like someone you met for 5 minutes and you're just projecting all this idealized content onto them, almost regardless of what they're really like. So that's one thing. But it could also be that this other person, in their own unwillingness to address unresolved content, is finding relief by taking action that compels other people to project their inner content onto them. So it could be that there's a deliberate attempt to hijack that process and present to you that image of what you want them to be, which they simply cannot be. It's impossible. That's just the way projection works, because we're taking something that is inherent, that is true, that is ideal, and that is in a template, and projecting that onto an external person that is impermanent and merely a representation of the realness within us. So they simply cannot meet that permanently. It's impossible. As Carl Jung said, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposites, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. This quote can tell us a lot about what's going on in the mind and in the world. And when we say conflict, as a rule of thumb here, I find it can help to think between what the ego wants and what the higher self is driving us towards, which is our potential, what we're capable of. So generally speaking, the conflict that Jung mentions here can be construed as a conflict between the ego, the idea of self, what it knows, the way it thinks about itself and its expectations of itself for the future, and the true self, including all our potential. And so in the case of codependency, there's a reason why one might be attracted to a situation or a person that both seems to tick a lot of boxes, brings a lot of temporary happiness, but at the same time give rise to terrible pain as well. And it's because something is trying to become resolved. So it usually has roots in childhood, and there is some unresolved feeling that is trying to become conscious. And in order for the true self to be realized, that feeling has to be reconciled. So the inner conflict between our full potential and the way we currently see ourselves and the way we understand ourselves to be creates a real world situation that must be navigated skillfully not with an extreme approach, neither aggressively fighting the situation and just scapegoating people, banishing them from our lives, only for it to reoccur. But likewise, neither passively backing away from the situation, hoping that it disappears. It needs to be addressed, resolved consciously, and that's the real win, right? That's how we truly make the unconscious conscious. So despite the deception being employed at the attraction phase, codependency would not be possible if there were not unconscious needs being met on both sides of the equation. And this unconscious attraction is what makes it so difficult to see many of the early warning signs that are present in these relationships, but just don't get seen by us, right? So this unconscious dynamic is what enables abusers such as narcissists and cult leaders to employ various kinds of undue influence and mind control. The previous episode was all about undue influence and mind control, and I looked at Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which is the model he developed to help understand the dynamics of cults. It stands for behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I believe it can be quite neatly applied to control at all levels, not just cult dynamics, but also in abusive narcissistic relationships, but also actually more broadly as well in tyrannical governments. So any situation where there's codependency, right? Any situation where there is a unwillingness to look at one's own unresolved feeling and hence create evil, right? The BITE model is essentially how evil plays out in the world. Think of it that way. So there are many potential aspects of our unconscious that may lead us into an exploitative situation. So there's really countless ways in which this might be occurring. Bear in mind, we're kind of using the left brain here to try and describe something that is, in reality, like completely impossible to truly pin down. We're talking about the action of the unconscious mind. So nothing I say here should be taken as gospel or set in stone. It's better thought of as a pointer or a guide towards what might be going on. And you can use your own language to describe and understand that. But really, the work that's required here is experiential. It's about facing up to reality and the present moment and allowing feeling to run its course. That's really how change is made at a psychological level. So there are some common themes as to what might be at play in the attraction phase, but really these are just a very general pointer to what might be going on at a deeper level. So clearly, at a basic level, abusers may provide their targets with something that looks like a sense of belonging, love and connection, significance, growth, or security. So they're not providing the real thing, they're providing what merely looks like these things that we all need. If there is an unconscious fear of not having these things, then the way this typically works is we'll find ourselves seeking what merely looks like it in the world, in the physical world, because it placates that unconscious fear. It looks like what the ego needs. Of course, like security, right? Let's take that as an example. True security comes from one's own capacity to deliver value, which comes from personal sovereignty. There's no real security in the physical world. There's merely a temporary appearance of it. Even if you had $1 million in the bank, right? You see this with lottery winners, people who win millions of dollars, but haven't had the grounding in money management, what it takes to make and preserve and maintain that kind of money, and then to actually do valuable things with it. And two things tend to happen in these situations. Firstly, sometime later, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that money's all gone. And secondly, they're actually no happier than they were prior to getting it. So where's the security in that? There's no security in money. There's only security in one's own skill with money, making, maintaining, and using wealth. So where any of these overarching needs, these basic human needs, are not currently being met in your life, this can open you up to potential targeting by unempathic individuals and groups, people who are not practicing empathy, That is, they're not willing to be transformed by their experience. That means they're not willing to engage with their own unconscious and their own unresolved feelings. That means they're not willing to feel what you feel or feel what they feel by mirroring you, what you appear to be feeling. And that means they're willing to do whatever it takes to not go near those unresolved feelings in themselves. But it's worth reiterating here that this is all happening unconsciously. And, the ego, the conscious sense of I, this likes to create an experience that is coherent. It likes to make us think that we know what's going on, that we are completely in control of everything we decide. But the sense of freedom will accompany that, whether the decision is truly free or not. So even where decisions are being made unconsciously, it will seem like a conscious decision. And the ego will often typically justify, rationalize, create reasons as to why what it's doing is a good idea. But really what's driving it behind the scenes are these unresolved feelings that haven't been made conscious. Another thing to watch out for, though, at the attraction phase is a tactic known as love bombing, right? So this is literally where an abuser or a narcissist will literally bombard you with what looks like love. Compliments, approval, validation, telling you that they think you're spiritually advanced and you're a perfect position and time to help the leader of this group with their grandiose mission, future faking, all these dreams about what might happen in the future. And, this is designed to knock you off your center, right? It's designed to tap into those basic needs. But of course, it's really providing a surrogate for true love. It's not actually true love. And it's actually intended just to manipulate. So just a practical tip there, something to be aware of, that if someone is being especially effusive with their love and concern for you, it might be worth thinking, okay, what's really going on with this person? Are they really acting from a place of compassion and empathy here? Or are they actually trying to suppress an unresolved feeling of their own? Beyond these basic needs that I've discussed, though, there is also potential to project inner numinous content onto others through this process known as participation mystique. And this can be, if anything, even more powerful than the basic needs that I just covered. The need for security is one thing, but the need to realize our true potential, that's the ultimate goal, right? And so if we're taking our inner archetypes, our inner ideals of the anima, the animus, the mother, the father, the sage, the hero, Christ, and we then project that onto other people, we're going to feel pretty good in doing that, right? We're going to feel pretty whole as long as we are engaging in that interaction. The thing is, this process of participation mystique, it can be a very powerful thing for growth. And when you realize that you're doing it, it can be a very wonderful thing. When you realize that what you're really experiencing is an aspect of your own mind, and it can only be. But when you don't realize that that's what's going on, that opens you up to manipulation and a lot of pain when that projection inevitably cannot be realized anymore, because this person is never going to be able to meet that projection permanently. So that's another factor in the attraction phase. And a third and highly prominent factor here is the persona shadow dynamic. So generally, our shadow, that is the repressed aspects of our own mind, our own personality, that also plays a role. So if we have identified as someone who's perhaps very caring and compassionate and giving, we don't want to be seen as the opposite, right? The opposite of that would be uncaring, cruel, and selfish, something like this. But what that then means is that we want to act and be seen as what we've deemed the positive side of that coin, right? The persona. And it means that we fear being seen as the shadow. We don't want to be seen as anything like uncaring. But sometimes that determination to always act as the persona prevents us from actually bringing on board potentially valuable aspects of the shadow. Because no one's saying it's useful to be cruel, right? Because that would be a one-sided approach to any situation, one that doesn't take on board compassion. What about things that look like cruelty? What about things that look like selfishness? If we don't even allow ourselves to look after ourselves for even 5 minutes, then how can we possibly hope to be kind and giving and compassionate, right? So it's not about being one or the other. It's about finding the middle way between the persona and the shadow. But what tends to happen here is that those feelings that we don't want to go near, those fears and the associated feelings of being seen as the shadow, well, they have to be brought back into balance at some point. So we will be put face to face with the shadow at some point, and we will attract situations that try and get us to allow these feelings to run their course. So in reality, there are innumerable reasons and feelings with the potential to become conscious that cannot be measured nor neatly defined in language. But what I've hoped to do here is just to give some little pointers and some little rules of thumb to better help you think about the dynamics that might be at play during the attraction phase. So the primary challenge of the attraction phase is that the unconscious is driving and you're not aware of it. The primary risk is in not realizing the supreme influence of the unconscious. You become susceptible to any means of placating its needs, right? So not what it really needs, not true love, not true connection, not true empathy, but something that just appears to resolve one's craving for it. It's not the real thing. So we start grasping at superficial, short-term, expedient means of coping with that issue rather than going near the actual fear and making it conscious. The primary opportunity of the attraction phase, well, there aren't many opportunities at this phase because by nature of it, the unconscious is in almost full control. And until the results of that conflict manifest in the world, it's going to be quite difficult for us to see what's really going on behind the scenes. If there is an opportunity, it's a temporary one. It's typically to engage in something that's enjoyable, exciting, and we need not deny that. Like, that is true. There is pleasure in the attraction phase, but the main lessons tend to come later. So the second phase of codependency is what I call the bliss phase. And the transition from the attraction phase to the bliss phase may be gradual, but it is usually marked by some psychological milestone. Like, when you look back, you'll realize there was actually a moment or maybe a series of moments where it went from this heady, magnetic attraction that just seemed to be kind of happening somehow to a state of commitment where you consciously thought, yeah, this is the person or this is the group for me, and I can really see this working out. So it can be marked by a felt sense of, I've made it, like this is it. This is my life now. You feel like you've figured it all out. And it's usually accompanied by a renewed sense of purpose. So there's a lot of energy and will being directed through this interaction. That's completely normal, right? And sometimes looking back on these dynamics, there can be some confusion because it's like, well, but I was having such a great time. I had so much energy. It seemed like such a worthwhile thing at the time. And therein is a lesson about the mind, right? And how the mind really works. And just because it felt so compelling and real doesn't mean that it was. And it's really important to reflect on that as part of one's recovery. So at this stage, there are few, if any, conflicts that are conscious in your mind. So things just pretty much seem essentially good. Nothing's really gone awry yet. If there are any conflicts, they are pretty quickly handled, suppressed, regulated by the conscious mind, and they tend to be seeming to not be a problem. And this is highly likely a repeat of an old pattern that you've been through. But at this stage, it still does not seem to resemble any previous occurrences. It seems like something entirely new. It seems like it's a new person, a new place, new situation. There is nothing in this situation that resembles your previous challenges. If anything, it appears like the ideal solution to those old occurrences at this stage. So the bliss phase may last for some time. It's actually in the interests of abusers that you remain in this phase for as long as possible. Like, they're doing everything they can to try and keep you there, not for your own benefit, of course, but because it serves their true intention, which is to attain narcissistic supply and other perceived benefits from you. So when conflicts do arise, they will try to move you back to this phase. And that's often achieved by offering you suggestions that repress and rationalize the legitimate source of conflict in yourself rather than to resolve it honestly. And so this can be done under the guise of trying to help you in some way. And that can be quite confusing if you don't know what's going on. By being in the bliss phase, there's a tendency to think that everything's going great, right? And the group and the individuals involved have your best interests at heart. And it can be easy to do a sort of little bait and switch here where you go kind of like, oh, well, I suppose I am experiencing benefits. Like when I was part of a Buddhist cult, one example of how this was employed was, oh, well, you are receiving benefits to your mind, aren't you? How is your mind now? Is your mind feeling less busy than it was before? And so this is a way of sort of trying to feed the ego a little hook to try and repress and rationalize the real issue, the real conflict. Of course, this is completely futile because we're dealing with mere expedient representations here of a deeper issue that has to be resolved at some point. But generally, narcissists and manipulative types, of course, they don't realize that. They're not fans of the unconscious mind. They may have some idea of an unconscious mind, or they may understand that other people make decisions from an unconscious place. But when the spotlight's turned on themselves, it's like, well, I don't need to change. In fact, I better not change, because the moment I do any self-reflection, I just experience pain. So they've set their stall out to never change. And they've kind of made it their MO to manipulate, control, whether overtly or covertly, the world around them, to perpetually protect against those unresolved feelings, which, when you do take responsibility for your mind and you do start moving that direction, you start to see that that is utterly futile. Like, it's like chucking a ball up in the air and hoping that it doesn't come back down to earth again. Good luck with that. It has to come down to earth eventually. I mean, you can kind of like, try and keep it up there. You can keep doing like kick-ups or whatever to try and keep it in the air. But at some point, you're going to fail at that eventually. So better just to facilitate the process of things coming back to equanimity. In a nutshell, I'm saying here that as much as they may try to move you back and that you may also be complicit in that, like there may be an unwillingness to go near unresolved feeling on both sides, it is ultimately a doomed exercise. So the primary challenge at the bliss phase is simply that you are blissfully unaware of what is really going on. Like, you're having a great time. You feel really peaceful, really content, really joyful, perhaps really excited about what's going on in your life. And you do not realize the projection that is occurring, this idealization of this person or this group, and the misdirection that's being employed by them to encourage that projection. So the primary risk here is the cost of time commitment. Like, you may be having a great time. You may think that what you're doing is productive and working towards some future dream, but really that's actually a fake vision, and you're becoming ever more attached over time to the individual or the group, physically, emotionally, financially, perhaps legally, spiritually. There is an opportunity here though, and that is to learn something valuable. So even though the intention may be perverse, there is actually practical lessons that can be gleaned from this, whatever it is. If you're in a relationship with someone, a two-person relationship, and they have certain qualities that you can learn from, like that's always the case, right? Like, no one is truly bad. Yeah. There's always virtues in every person, and there's reasons that we were attracted to them. And it may be that they represent light aspects of our shadow as well as the dark aspects, most likely. And there are skills we can learn from these people. In the case of an exploitative cult, there may be a doctrine that, despite being completely corrupted and geared with the intention of creating codependency and supporting a grandiose fantasy, that's not to say that there aren't useful elements within it that, when applied in a wholesome way, do actually have value. So it could be that it's a self-help group that's teaching tools for financial freedom. It might be that they're teaching digital marketing skills. They may be teaching them in the hope that you use those skills to market their own MLM product and advance the social status of the leader. But that doesn't mean you have to use them to that end. You can then take those skills and use them in an honest way, towards a wholesome end. There's always value that can be gleaned. But the thing is, the main lesson is never what it purports to be. Like, you might think that you are joining this cult because you want to do something to save the world, right? You think the leader and their doctrine has what the world needs, and you, in all your humility, want to be part of that. Well, that's never going to be the real lesson. The real lesson will pertain to what is going on inside you and what you really need to do as part of your own individuation journey. So the third phase is what I call the conflict phase. And this is marked by when you become consciously aware of a mounting number of conflicts that cannot be rationalized. So these tend to accrue over time. During the previous bliss phase, you're not really aware of them, or they've been adequately suppressed. But inevitably over time, these things start to mount up and you start to become consciously aware of them. So, these are examples of the kinds of things that might create conflict. So no doubt at some point you see the mask slip in the other person, in the abuser. You start to see their persona shadow dynamic at play. You see how they were upholding a persona this whole time. And even though they might be able to hold it down pretty good, like 95% of the time, a large part of that is simply because that's what you want to see in them. And you're not allowing yourself to see what's really going on. But then, no matter how much you want to see them as the persona they've laid out for themselves and as the hook for your own inner content, it's impossible to meet that projection permanently. There isn't a cult leader on earth who has done their persona shadow dynamic, right? By definition. Because if they are deliberately trying to placate their own unresolved feelings and using other people as a way to do that, and using their persona as a means to encourage projection, then they haven't done their shadow work. It's just true by default. So at some point, you're going to see that persona slip and you're going to see the shadow present itself. It's just going to happen at some point. That may, for example, encourage you to learn a bit more about this person's history. And you might find some pretty morally suspect things. It may not be entirely clear cut, but it may not be easy to rationalize either. And that will leave you with some concerns either way. And not least, the mounting cost to your time, your energy, your contribution to the rest of society, and your relationships outside of this one, outside of the cult perhaps. Over time, these things start to mount up, and the opportunity cost starts to weigh quite heavy on your conscience. So these are all possible catalysts of conflicts coming to the surface. So as long as the projection is occurring, as long as you are engaged in this process of participation mystique, where you're projecting inner ideals onto the world, conflict is inevitable. So the main challenge here is to find a way to manage the mounting cacophony of inner conflicts. Right, at some point, they can no longer merely be placated. They're going to have to be resolved. And so the main risk here is that these conflicts are detected by the abusing party, who no doubt have many strategies for mitigating these conflicts in exploitative ways and for increasing your ties to them. So on reflection, you might have noticed how they started making moves. They started trying to get you more involved in various ways, like wanting to move in with you or wanting to sign certain contracts or opening a joint bank account or getting a joint mortgage or getting you to do work for them in the community, like getting you to make friends with other people in the cult, getting you to build your emotional investment with this person. There's all many ways they can sort of try and increase your ties, which every little one of these disincentivizes you from leaving, even though it's inevitable that you will encounter conflict and that you have to resolve this at some point. They don't understand that. They think that as long as they just wrangle with these material factors, that they can secure their narcissistic supply into the future. It's a hopelessly futile task, but in the unwillingness to gain insight, they just can't realize it. So the opportunity at the conflict phase is that this is the beginning of a higher understanding. Every little conflict is a potential step forward when it is eventually resolved. So having more conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that the ultimate lesson is going to be that much more significant. So this then leads to the clash phase. And this is very much what Carl Jung was pointing to when he was talking about how the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposite halves. It's just inevitable at some point. So eventually the inner conflicts remaining unresolved will compound to the point of being forced to play out in a real world situation. Here's the thing, the ego wants to stay with what it knows. It wants to remain placated by the relationship, having its deepest desires for love, affection, and identification with a persona gratified. And likewise, it wants to not be identified with the shadow. But on the other hand, the self, with a capital S, is communicating to the ego that the situation is not what it seems, and a course correction is needed. There are unresolved feelings which must be made conscious in order for that true potential to be realized. So this, of course, must play out in the world as a clash. Now, here's the thing with a clash. It doesn't necessarily lead to progress. It can actually, if not navigated skillfully, lead to a backstep. There's a risk here in that rather than move forward to the fifth phase, the recovery phase, the ego cannot bear the short-term pain, discomfort, and grasping at immediate relief, we revert back to the bliss phase and that codependent situation. So that relief is experienced just simply from the situation being over. There might be some niggling sense of, have I really resolved this? Is this just going to repeat again? But the ego likes to push away those thoughts because it's painful, rather just stick with what's comfortable now. So the challenge here at the clash phase is simply that it's a testing experience that the ego would rather avoid. And it can happen multiple times, right? If we aren't taking responsibility for the mind, it's just like a merry-go-round, right? We're just going through the clash, back to the bliss phase, conflict, clash, bliss, conflict, clash, until eventually it just becomes so compelling that we have to break out of it. But way better to actually make a break proactively, and to do so physically and psychologically, right? To claim one's sovereignty, to bravely look at what is going on, both internally and externally, right? It's neither about creating blame, nor is it about trying to avoid all discernment at all costs. It's an opportunity to actually use the situation as fuel for deep personal and spiritual growth. So it's dangerous in all ways. And in the ebook, I talk about the 5 dangers of cult codependency. I also mentioned these earlier. They are physical, financial, legal, emotional, and spiritual. So the clash phase presents dangers in all 5 of those categories. But it will be necessary to face up to those dangers in order to truly break away and to evolve spiritually. So if we can navigate that clash phase skillfully, we then enter the recovery phase. And this is marked by a firm exit. This is the moment at which we go, okay, I'm definitely out of this now. There's still work to be done, but the relationship is over and you've made a firm decision. So the recovery phase is everything that happens afterwards. At some point, your recovery will be more or less complete. And, that could be a day, it could be 2 years, but the journey never stops. But the recovery phase tends to fade out over time. There will be milestones along the way, but there is generally no single moment where you go, okay, the recovery's done now. If anything, as much as you can understand that your recovery is done, it's not wise to say, therefore, I don't need to be aware of any additional growth I might need. That's the realms of narcissism, right? That's this tantalizing idea of enlightenment and perfection as a human that really just rationalizes one's own controlling compulsive tendencies to get the world to meet its preferences. So the aim of the recovery phase is not to erase the experience from your memory, but to accept it, to work with it, to engage with the challenges, and to use the experience as fuel for personal and spiritual growth. So this is a bit of a difference from the content I make and the more mainstream pop psychology content based on narcissism and codependency. And in my opinion, a lot of that is quite really just like demonizing the other person. And I've encountered the worst of evil in this world, and I have seen what it is, right? It's real, it's dark, and it needs to be faced up to, right? If anything, by merely saying, oh, they're just evil, I mean, we're basically implying that, well, if all we did then was just line these people up and shoot them, wouldn't our problems all be solved? And what that does is it really negates the evil in oneself, right? It actually fosters one's own evil, and that means to foster one's own unconsciousness. So there's a place for both seeing evil for what it is and taking responsibility. And this is the fear that a lot of people have, is that if we look at ourselves and take responsibility for the mind, then it makes the other person guiltless, right? It excuses them. And actually, no, it doesn't mean any of that. There's a place for both of these things. And if anything, it's the unwillingness to look at ourselves that creates the kind of evil that we wish to eliminate in the world. So it really starts with making it conscious in yourself. It's not denying or excusing anything that's happening out there. And I actually think that it's necessary to do that. It's necessary to see other actors in this world as they really are, as they're really behaving. No one is inherently evil, right? That's an ego construct. There is no such thing as an evil person, as much as there may be people who predominantly do evil. But as we said, evil is a product of the unconscious and of chasing what really looks like what the true self needs as a way to placate unconscious fears and desires that aren't being seen and aren't being taken responsibility for. So we really need to be able to walk this line here between calling a spade and working with our own mind as it really is. So the next episode will be devoted to the exit and recovery process. I'm going to go into more detail there, but I'll just say a little bit about the recovery phase. The first priority is to, once you've made that decision, to remain firm and maintain a safe distance. This may not be the best time to be taking lots of important actions. Like if there is a lot of emotional turmoil, then I would generally suggest that you give that the time and space it needs to pass, unless there are any really urgent, critical, straightforward actions that need to be taken. Right. So it's really down to the individual to prioritize that effectively. I would just offer a word of caution both ways and say, yeah, make sure you don't neglect to do anything that must be done, whether it's something legal or something physical, like to get away physically to find physical safety. But at the same time, be careful not to overestimate your ability to act carefully, skillfully, given the emotional upheaval that might be going on. And if there are intense emotions that are trying to come to the surface, let them come to the surface. Like, this is really all about facing up to feeling. Like, allow that to happen. Don't repress it. To give yourself the time and space to do that. At the same time, be practical, right? So there's always a balance to be struck here. But a really key point, though, is that a full recovery requires more than simply leaving and going no contact, right? You know, narcissism channels and like Quora.com, they're flooded with talk of no contact. And hey, there's wisdom in this, right? Because if someone has demonstrated themselves to be a narcissist, you know, that is a observable phenomenon. It's not a judgment. It is a thing that happens. Yes, on one level, it's a label, but it's also something we can observe and that could in principle be measured, right? And it comes from the fact that the persona is so rigid that the feelings it's protecting are so extreme that without some serious work, this person has decided to never let that go at any cost. They have to go to extreme lengths of deception, coercion, whatever it takes to maintain that self-image. It is not an enviable state. As much as these people may present themselves as being effervescent, calm, peaceful, it's precisely because they're covering up that opposite in themselves, in truth. So it's not the place for putting yourself in harm's way. Like, that is their decision. That is their result that they have set themselves up for. It's not your fault that they end up without people close to them, without true connection, with a series of failed relationships. That is not your fault. It is their own doing for making themselves incapable of true connection. There's a number of reasons why they do that, but their own personal responsibility does play a huge role, invariably. And if we simply get back in touch and try and help them or fix them, we're doing nothing to advance coming to consciousness in ourselves or in them, or anything to resolve the problems of evil in our world. We're not actually helping them. For someone who has decided to not ever connect with the world or practice true empathy, an entirely appropriate and commensurate response to that person is to walk away. That is, sadly, the most helpful thing you can do for that person. It is the only way of creating the kinds of consequences that might just compel them to transform. Most likely, they will choose to merely adapt, to hone their skills at whatever it is, to manipulate, to charm, to persuade, to make money in some perverse and dishonest way. But if transformation is a possibility, it's not going to come from you trying to make them feel better, try to fix them. That is not the language they talk at this point in time. So no contact is on some level necessary, sure. But here's the thing. There's a difference between going no contact and ghosting. It's quite an important difference. Because ghosting suggests that we haven't really resolved an issue in ourselves, and that we're simply just cutting them off and moving on, as though we ourselves are just trying to wrangle with the external world to solve our inner issues. So if we feel the need to just simply ghost and just sort of brush it under the rug and hope it doesn't come back, then it suggests that we ourselves are actually also not facing up to unresolved feeling. Now, there's a kind of qualitative difference here in that sooner or later we are ebbing and flowing towards making the unconscious conscious. Hopefully, if you're watching this channel and you're watching it with wholesome intentions, then there's a large conscious part of you that is interested in genuine spiritual growth. If that's the case, there's never a case for ghosting. You may go no contact. You may decide that practically it's just best to do that and continue resolving the issue. I would suggest that as part of your own recovery, you consider what actions you could take that would actually be helpful in that process, that would help you to make the unconscious conscious in yourself, as well as be proactive and own the decision. Best not to leave people in the dark. Doesn't mean you need to repeat yourself, doesn't mean you need to re-engage, but as long as you know that you've made yourself clear, then you can safely move on without conflict as to how you handled it. Provided that you did so kindly, purposefully, and with the intention to make the unconscious conscious in yourself and the other person. Whether they actually choose to engage with their own unconscious content through the conditions you've presented to them, that's up to them. But provided you are practicing skillful communication, you can move on knowing that you did what you could. So the main challenge of the recovery phase is that it's likely to be a very tumultuous time. There's probably going to be a lot of confusion and conflict still to be resolved. And the main risk, therefore, is in repeating the pattern in some form if the recovery phase is not navigated skillfully. And, it may be necessary to go through an iteration one or two more times, hopefully in a less extreme way. Like, one thing that can happen in life is quite curious, is that after you have an extreme situation, like a big clash with a particular group or person, there can still be a few remnants of issues to be resolved, a few little conflicts here and there. And the world seems to have a way of providing confirmation to you. So like, you can then encounter similar people in future, people of similar positions to you, who continue on a theme of that same person that you were involved with before, but give you a new opportunity to engage with them in a skillful way, and also confirm for you that you have worked through the issue in yourself. So there's no judgment here. There's nothing like saying that anyone's bad or wrong for going through these experiences. As I mentioned in the past, if you think you're not the kind of person to need to go through learning experiences, then I would suggest that you probably need to go through learning experiences more than just about anybody. So there is a risk nonetheless, but all things work out in the end. I would just encourage you to approach these situations skillfully, find that middle way as a way to make the unconscious conscious and resolve that conflict. So the opportunity here is that it is a tremendous opportunity for insight and for personal and spiritual growth. And that is the recovery phase. That is what I'm going to be talking about in the next episode. So with that said, guys, I shall leave that there. I hope that's been useful, and I will talk to you next time.